When we talk about what we're going through now, I think many of us we go in cycles. We move from trust in the Lord, and through this process, we sometimes move to worries replacing God in our lives. We worry about all kinds of things, bothered by so many things, and the things that we worry about becomes the most central thing in our life. And then things happen, and we either begin to have health problems or other problems because of this, because we allowed those things, those circumstances, become number one in our lives. They overshadow the one we know and have a relationship with God. Such was true through the end of the life of Joshua for Israel. Israel went through cycles. You see, they went through the wilderness. They came out of Egypt, went through the wilderness, and every time there was opposition, there was a whole group that wanted to go back to Egypt. And that whole generation that saw those miracles in Egypt never made it to the promised land. And in fact, that promise of that land of flowing with milk and honey ended up to be for that next generation. The only two that was able to go with them going into the land was Caleb and Joshua, who believed God that God would help them to overtake the land that he promised. And Joshua goes in, he becomes the head, he gets passed over to be the next one in line for Moses. They crossed the Jordan. They ended up taking out Jericho. They go taking over the land, both north and south of the land. They settled into the land. Exactly what was prophesied by Moses and the blessing that he gave. They cast lots, and the lots began to fell exactly the way it was prophesied would happen in the settling of the land. So Joshua comes to a place in his life, he comes to an end of his life. And yet there were still things that needed to be conquered. And because of after the death of Joshua and those elders that knew somewhat of what God did, and the miracles even in the wilderness passed on, the next generation does not even know the God or have a relationship with him. Let me read from Judges. Judges chapter 2. And after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each of his own inheritance. And the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance in Timnath-Hereth, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that, the whole generation that had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped the various gods of the peoples round them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of their hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges and prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies. As long as the judge lived, for the Lord had compassion on them, and they groaned under those who oppressed them and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to their ways, even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because the nations has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord has allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. Talking about a cycle here, did you notice that first it says it happened with the judges, it happened with Joshua and those in leadership. When they died, the people reverted back and going after other gods. And so they sinned, and so what did God do? He brought oppressors. And in fact, throughout the book of Joshua, there are at least 6 times they go through this cycle with different oppressors. They got so bad that finally they cry out to God, and God brings them a deliverer, a judge. And as long as the judge was alive, everything was well. God blessed them. But when the judge dies, just like it happened with Joshua's death, the people reverted back to becoming just like the gods, worshiping the gods all around. That's the problem. It's a cycle. And again, what happened when they started serving other gods and worshiping like the gods around them? Those nations that God brought to them to a place that they cried out to God again, and God in his compassion delivered. I think a lot of times that's exactly where we go. We individually as well as a nation. I think at times we've even forgotten God. And we filled the blank with other things. Jesus warned this in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you can't serve two masters. Either you hate the one and love the other, or you be devoted to one and not the other. You cannot serve God and money. The point is that everybody in this world, and this is an argument for the existence of God, everybody, every human being on this planet worships something or someone. And we fill the blank with God, of God that should be taking that place with other gods. We struggle with that. We've forgotten him. We've moved away. We replaced him with our circumstances, with our situation. And because what becomes important to us now isn't God necessarily. And so things begin to happen in our lives. And we'd say, for Israel, was the enemy or the oppressor would come. We would fall into our circumstance, whether health-wise or financial-wise or worries, and just things that become overwhelming to us. And the reason they become overwhelming is because we didn't allow Jesus to be central to our lives. And so these things happen. We drift away. We know in our head that the strength doesn't come from us, it comes from him. And yet we think it's all about us. It's all about us. And yet we, at this point in our lives, in the cycle, either individually or as a nation, if we just turn and cry out to God, that we would seek his face, that he would respond in giving deliverance, giving healing. Seek him. And he, in his compassion, he does fulfill this. Now, here's the thing, is that even after God delivered Israel with the judges, or, of course, using Joshua earlier, did those nations go away that were oppressing? No, the enemy was still present even when God brought judgment and brought a judge to bring deliverance. Those nations were still there. They didn't go away. God said the reason they remained there is so that they would test about walking with him. I'm reminded of the Psalms, Psalm 23. And it says that the Lord prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Are the enemies still there? Yeah, they're there. But in the midst of the enemies, God prepares the table. Presence, relationship with him. His presence is in that moment. He prepares the table. There is peace and comfort in the midst of the enemy because of his presence. He prepares the table in the presence of the enemy. God raises up the judges to break the cycle of going after other gods, oppression, crying out to him. He delivers. He delivers. He prepares the table before the enemies. So the Lord, in our circumstance today and in our nation, or maybe individual things that you're going through today, he wants to prepare that table with you, sitting down in his presence, taking time, calling, conversation with him. And in that conversation, in that time of being still, he prepares the table even while everything else around us, the virus, people trying to figure out what to do and thinking that they can do it themselves and deal with situations all by themselves and being overwhelmed by it. In the moment of being still, in a moment of conversation, at the table, the enemy is still there, but the presence of God makes a difference. Knowing the presence of God and being still and know that he is God. In the book of Revelation, we have Jesus saying to the church of Laodicea, he says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone opens the door, I will come into him and sup with him and he with me." Now, he's not just talking about the individual, and most often that we would think in terms of the individual. That it's sometimes that scripture is used for individual making a decision, open the door of the heart, and we get this picture of Jesus knocking on the door of the heart, and the handle is on the inside and no handle on the outside in that picture. But let me ask you this. In this moment, Jesus is knocking on the door of the church. All across this nation. And he's knocking on the door. And he says, "Open the door, let me in, I will sup with you. I will show forth relationship." And each individual, we are, but every congregation across this in America right now, around the world, Christians, churches, Jesus is knocking on the door. And he says, "I want to come in. Will you make room for me to sit at the table with you?"